and we're back with more Cape Caribbean studies. We'll be continuing our journey today looking at the historical process. I'm Melissa Beckford Simpson and I'm your teacher. So for today, we are going to be examining the historical process. I promised you last week and here we are. Okay. So what is it that we want to do? What are our objectives? We want to name the various groups that have migrated to the Caribbean and the circumstances under which these migrations occurred. We want to describe the systems of production that have existed in the Caribbean. We want to explain the resistance efforts of the various groups as they were met with enslavement, colonization, and genocide. And we want to determine the extent to which these processes have impacted Caribbean society and culture. Welcome to our lesson. So let's get started right away. All right. So we want to talk about the migrations and experiences of the Caribbean people. And yes, that is one of the first things we talk about when we talk about the Caribbean people and its history. Now, I know that for some of you, history is not something that you really want to do and you're saying, why do I need to do history? Let's see if we can have a little fun learning today. All right? So the migrations that we have had into the Caribbean are first the indigenous peoples, and I know you're going, indigenous peoples, why? And they were here first, so how come migration? We'll talk about that. The Africans, free Africans, and we're going to discuss that too. The Europeans, forced African migration, and indentured workers from India, China, and so on. So we're going to examine these migrations. Now, the first groups of indigenous peoples that we had in the Caribbean were the Taino, the Kalinago, and the Maya. And yes, we no longer use the terms Arawaks and Caribs, as you would have heard, because Arawakan was the language that they all spoke. And we now know that they were the Taino, the Kalinago, and the Maya. Of course, the Taino were located in the Greater Antilles, the Kalinago in the Lesser Antilles for the most part, and the Maya in Belize. Now, before we move on, there were at least two territories when Columbus and the Europeans came in 1492 that were occupied by both Taino and Kalinago. Can you guess that and tell me at the end? Let's see. All right. And then we go a little bit deeper now into the migrations. So the ancestors of the indigenous peoples who were here at 1492, and note that I use the date 1492, but I use it very, very carefully because even though we generally look at our history from that period, note that these people were here long before. And so even though written history began round about that time, we're still looking at the migrations even before that. Our history did not begin at 1492. So the ancestors of the indigenous peoples migrated to the Caribbean from Asia hundreds of years ago, thousands even, in the last ice age. And I know you've watched the movies Ice Age and you saw, not quite so, not one acorn turning the world upside down, not necessarily. But there were these ice ages, and in the last ice age, that is when they migrated, crossing the Bering Strait. Today, the Bering Strait is not frozen. At that time it was. It's just water. All right? So they followed animals that were migrating like the mammoth, and they use these animals both for food and for their warmth. All right? They settled in different parts of the Americas, north, south, central, and the groupings of the Taino and the Kalinago that were seen in the Caribbean area in 1492, at 1492, were direct descendants of people who were coming from South America. And so they were doing a kind of island hopping, coming up from South America through to the Lesser Antilles and then on to the Greater Antilles. Yes, so there we have it. And then we see this grouping here, for the most part, we are looking at the Greater Antilles, where the Taino peoples were to be found, Cuba and Jamaica and Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and they were also to be found going up into the Bahamas as well. So there we have. And then a little further out, you'll notice the archipelago of the Lesser Antilles, like we discussed last week. And this area was mostly occupied by the Kalinago people. All right? So we look at these three groupings of people, and you'll notice that not much is here about the Maya, but the Maya were also very important. They occupied the Central American region. We're talking about Mexico, Honduras, and so on, and Belize. They occupied this region. So how them drop in? I know you're asking that question. How them drop in? Because Belize, like we discussed last week, Belize is a Caribbean country, mainly because of its historical experiences as well as in a political sense too, because it is a part of CARICOM. So we have to look at the Maya because they occupied Belize. Now, the Maya, of course, would have been the most advanced of the three groupings. That's not to say that these people did not have a specific ordered society when Columbus came and saw them. So contrary to popular belief, they were not just running up and down like they were mad, and they had no settlement. They had settlement. They had defined political, social, and economic structures, very similar to our own, I might add. They had defined religious settings and so on, though they were polytheistic. So these people had their own well-ordered society. They were not barbaric, and they were not necessarily, especially the Taino and Kalinago, not necessarily cannibals. All right? So what did they experience, right? So the whites came, the Europeans came and saw them. What did they experience? Their well-ordered society was destabilized. Destabilized. So their economic structures, their political structures, their religious structures, they were destabilized as they were enslaved. First with the repartimiento system and then with the encomienda system, which were the two main forced systems of labor. So the Europeans came, and of course, in the Caribbean era, there was not as much gold as they would have wanted, right? Perhaps a little in Hispaniola and so on. And so they needed some kind of commodity. And they came, and tobacco became the commodity. Of course, tobacco was something that the indigenous people used quite a bit in their own religious practices. So it became a commodity now for trading, for planting, for trading, for selling. And so the indigenous peoples were engaged. And you notice I use the word engaged. They were forcibly engaged to do the work. They were enslaved to do that work. Then we have the destruction, as we said, of the social, economic, political, and religious systems. So everybody became enslaved, right? And so the cacique who was at the head of the society, the Taino society, was no longer in charge. So all of these structures, the village headmen, who were called mitayanos, they were no longer in charge. And so everybody was now enslaved. They also resisted. Yes, and we'll go a little bit more into resistance. But the long and short of it is the genocide of the indigenous groupings of people, particularly the Taino and Kalinago. Now, what is genocide? It is a systematic system of complete or near complete destruction. It is targeted of a group of people of the same ethnicity or race. These people were targeted, and so in no time, in less than 100 years, they were almost gone. Despite the efforts of one who tried his best to implement the laws of Burgos and petition the Queen to ensure that they were protected. All right? Think of the name of that individual. Do you know the name of that individual who tried to ensure that they were protected? Long and short of it, as I said, genocide was the result. All right. So we see the migrations here, as we said, with the different groupings of people, and we're looking at the map of the Caribbean again, and we're able to see how the Caribbean is situated. We are extracting over here the Lesser Antilles, and as we said, for the most part, the Lesser Antilles contained the Kalinago, people who were, by the way, very warlike. All right, now we're looking at migration still. So how did this come in? What is all of this about? All right, now this is placed here, and I know they probably jump out at you a little bit, but what are we looking at here? We are looking at the production of a thesis by one Ivan van Sertima, who proposed in 1976 that there were people who came to the Caribbean before Columbus came, before the Spanish came. And even there are other theories too that say that even the Vikings came to the Caribbean region before Columbus came. So it's not necessarily true to say that after the indigenous peoples then came Columbus in 1492. Not quite. So let's look back at Van Sertima's thesis. He presented botanical evidence and these colossal images that we just saw to show that Africans were in the Caribbean before freed Africans, people who traveled from Africa, take their own boats and traveled here, not enslaved. They actually traveled to parts of the region, not necessarily in the Caribbean, but in Central America, for example, and South America. All right, let's look back at those images just a little bit and see if we can understand why we would say that that is the case. All right? Let's see if we can look back at those images. Yes. What do they look like? They don't look like you. I think they look like me. I don't know of any white person looking that way with the nose looking like that, you know, and the forehead. These are images of black people. And this is what Sertima argues, that these are images of black people. And so it could only mean that Africans were in the Caribbean region before Columbus came in 1492. All right, so that dispels the belief that the Europeans were the only ones who were out exploring in the age of exploration and that they were the only one advanced enough to do something like this. It dispels all of those notions. Now, we want to also look at the Europeans coming. We want to look at them coming in 1492. Columbus came, 4 voyages he did. In fact, Columbus was very much lost, you know. He stumbled upon the Caribbean, he was lost. And when he came, he saw these people. He didn't know where he was. And so we end up with the false naming of the Caribbean, the West Indies, because in his mind, he had reached the Indies. All right? And so the Indies was what he was looking for. He was out looking for a new trade route to the Indies, to China, to India, because they were rivals with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese had long since found the African coast and were trading with West Africa and so on. So not to be outdone, and even though Columbus is Italian, not to be outdone, Spain decided to back Columbus's voyages. And so he made 4 voyages eventually to the Caribbean region. Now, eventually, what happened was that Spain claimed all of these areas in the Caribbean for themselves. And they set out to Christianize the peoples that they found, according to Queen Isabella's directive. Now, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed between Spain and Portugal. And what it did effectively, because there was some rivalry between both Spain and Portugal. So the Treaty of Tordesillas essentially divided the earth in 2 and gave all the lands to the west of the line to Spain and all the lands to the east of the line to Portugal. And thought that they had ended the matter. Incoming, you have the English, the French, the Dutch, who decided that they needed a piece of the pie. They saw that by this time Spain was raking in big profits and all kinds of riches and gold and so on coming to Spain. You've watched the movies, you've watched Pirates of the Caribbean, you've seen these things that they have projected, right? And so they needed a piece of the pie. They decided that they wanted to be part of it. And so they came in through trading, through smuggling, through piracy, through buccaneering, through privateering, what we call privateering, which were licenses given to these individuals. They then broke Spain's monopoly. And eventually, we ended up with the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, the English, the Danish, all of them having colonized some area of the Caribbean. Now, after that, we ended up with the forced African migration. How did this come about? The genocide of the indigenous peoples that we spoke about. This took place. And so they needed to replace the labor force with somebody. And so the Africans were chosen, please note, chosen in quotation marks, for several reasons, economic and racial, as the best replacement for the indigenous peoples. Now, there are some historians who argue, such as Eric Williams, that the choosing of Africans as the replacement labor force was simply an economic matter and not necessarily racial at the beginning. And so he argues that they simply needed to be able to have a labor force for this replacement crop. Tobacco was the first crop. Tobacco was no longer doing well, and so they needed a replacement crop. Sugarcane was chosen. Why? Because in Europe, they were tea drinking, and they needed something to sweeten. And the sweetener that they used to use was honey, and it was very expensive. So it was now popular to have teas and, scones and all of those things, and they needed a sweetener. So sugarcane was chosen. In fact, sugarcane fit the bill because sugarcane could thrive in the climate of the Caribbean. But there was a problem. In order to grow sugarcane successfully, you needed huge plantations and you needed quite a bit of labor force. So the Africans were chosen as the replacement labor force for the indigenous peoples. They were carried in ships, in holds, built to carry goods along 3 legs of a trade we call the triangular trade. All right? So how did this come about? Now, Spain was not allowed to trade on the West African coast, and so they had to sign an agreement called the Asiento with the Portuguese for them to ship these Africans for them to enslave. Now, please note that I'm not saying slaves. Please note that I'm using the word enslaved because Africans were people that were then enslaved. It's not to say that they were slaves already because it's not intrinsic for you to be a slave. And so Africans were enslaved. So the Dutch, for example, and the Portuguese and so on, they established these huge companies, the Royal African Company, the Dutch West India Company, and these companies were responsible for the transshipment of people from West Africa along one leg of the journey called the Middle Passage. Let us see if we can look at that just a little bit. Let's look at the triangular trade as shown here. Why do we call it a triangle? Of course, a triangle has 3 different points. And so there were 3 points to this trade. You had the first point and the leg starting from Europe to West Africa. That was the first leg. So they would take along with them, as you see, their textiles, rum, manufactured goods. And then they would come to West Africa, and then they would pick up people. They would pick up people, Africans, and take them across this second leg called the Middle Passage. And then these persons would be enslaved on sugar plantations in the West Indies and in North America, cotton for North America. And then these goods were then transshipped again all the way back to West Africa, and the cycle continued. So that is precisely how the triangular trade worked. Now, where in West Africa did these people come from? Let's look at some West African areas, all right? And note the arrow here indicating they're moving. So we have the Ivory Coast, the Gold Coast, the Slave Coast. What are we talking about? We're talking about people from the Yoruba Kingdom, the Kingdom of Oyo and Benin, and the Asante peoples, Dahomey. We can see these places here in West Africa. And these were the places, for the most part, that Africans were either kidnapped from, or tribal wars caused them to sell each other to the Europeans on the coast. And then they were transshipped across the Middle Passage to the West Indies. Now, the Middle Passage is considered to be the most gruesome leg of the three-legged trade. And obviously, because this was the leg where human beings became the cargo on board the ships. Now, note, in some cases, it were the same ships that traveled with the goods from Europe to West Africa that were then filling up the holds with people. And so you can just imagine how the people were inside the belly of these ships. Now, it took 6 to 12 weeks, and any number of things could cause this to be the case. They could have hurricanes, they could run out of food and had to make stops or something like that, right? And then they endure diseases such as dysentery because they were in the same place, eating in the same place, and passing waste in the same place. Little food. They endured sexual abuse. Little exercise. Sometimes once a week they were brought on deck and a whip was used and they had to jump. They had to dance. Right? And then little fresh air. And of course, heat. So all of this combined made it a miserable experience. And some of them did try to jump overboard. Some were successful in jumping overboard. Some were successful in revolting on board the ship. And we will look at those a little bit more. So there we see it, how they were collected and they were carried from the interior to the coast. This is called a coffle. This grouping of them is called a coffle. A yoke is around their necks. And then this is how they were brought on deck now for exercise and for sunlight. And you can just imagine when the sun hits them in their eyes after being in the dark for so long. They were temporarily blind. Now look at the interior of the ship. This is a cross-sectional layout of the ship. And these are individuals that you're looking at. And they were lying down flat on their backs as they were transported. No room to maneuver in little holes. And they were chained hands and feet to each other. This is what the interior of the ship looked like. Make no mistake, this experience was also very gruesome for the crew on board the ship because some of them would also have these diseases and so on. So it was all in all a very, very, very gruesome experience in the transshipment of Africans from West Africa to the West Indies. Now, the last grouping that we're going to be looking at are the indentured immigrants. Now, indentureship wasn't something that was necessarily new because the Europeans did try indentureship after round about the time when the indigenous peoples began to die out. But it wasn't successful. People from Scotland and Ireland and so on, they were unable to manage the work on the plantation and they were not enslaved, right? So they were working for wages and it did not work out for a steady labor supply as they needed. So we're talking about indentured immigrants in that period that was not very successful. But we're also talking about at the end of slavery, when in the 1840s and 1850s, persons were brought here from their different places in order to work, to replace Africans, and also to kind of act as a buffer in between the races. What were these push factors? Why did these people leave from where they were to come here? They left because of unemployment, starvation in some cases, war and civil unrest, such as in China. And they wanted better for themselves and their families. And so they were told there are all of these opportunities for you to come and work and earn wages, and then you will be allowed to go back home when you are ready. Sometimes after 5-year contracts, 3-year contracts, and even at the very end, 1-year contracts. So they were brought here to replace the Africans for a steady labor supply. Notice I said steady labor supply, because it is not true that there was a mass exodus from the plantations after slavery ended. All right, so these are the places where they came from. We're talking about Calcutta was one of the main areas that they were transported from to the West Indies, and we're looking here at how they were transported, right? Looking at the map of the world. So we're seeing India in this region here, and we're focusing just a little bit on Indian indentureship, because the Indian indentureship was the largest grouping. We did have Chinese, and we did have Javanese and Madeirans and even Jews who came. But the Indian immigration scheme was the largest one. And so they traveled. It was a longer journey, obviously, than the Africans endured. And there are documentations, historical documentations, to show that the journey was also very, very gruesome for the Indians to arrive here. All right? So we have essentially covered the migrations. Let us move quickly now into looking at systems of production that were developed. And we go back to the indigenous peoples. Now, the indigenous peoples had their own systems of production. They were farmers, right? They were also fishers and traders and so on. They, planted on a very small scale, subsistence. They planted mainly manioc, which is cassava, and the Taino, and the Maya, I beg your pardon, the Maya were the ones who planted maize, which is corn. They developed the slash and burn method, right, which would also add some nutrients to the soil, and this was the main method of clearing land. They also developed complex irrigation systems, and their work was communal, as in the case of the Taino, as well as if it was not communal, it was specifically designated, as in the complex structures of the Maya. All right? And then now we move from that system to the plantation system, and the plantation system obviously was implemented by the Europeans, starting with the Spanish and then going on with the British and the French and so on. Now, we call this transition from these systems into the plantation system, we call it the sugar revolution, because it was a revolution because it changed every aspect of the West Indian society and politics and so on. Tobacco was replaced by sugarcane as the main crop, and the system of chattel slavery was introduced with which enslaved Africans and had them as the main laborers on the plantation. And the plantation became what we call a total institution because of it. Now let's look at this cross-section of a typical sugar plantation, all right? A typical sugar plantation was huge. And sometimes it could be as much as 2,000 acres, all right? And so we see different areas on the plantation. We see the great house, different other houses such as the bookkeeper's house. We are seeing the cane fields. We are seeing the slave huts. We are seeing the works area. The works area here. We are seeing also several other buildings and so on. We're seeing woodland over here. This was the general idea of what a sugar plantation looked like. All right? And these were early drawings of typical sugar plantations. Notice that there are slopes here, right? Usually, most times the plantations were built on slopes. All right? Could you tell me why? Do you think you could tell me why the plantations were usually built on slopes? All right? And we have here a typical great house. And this great house on this plantation was also on a slope. This is actually the Rosal Great House. Yes, very famous one. There we have workers cutting the cane, and we have a part of the works yard here. That would be the mill where the sugar is cut and then brought, and the juice is squeezed out to be boiled in the boiling house, and then eventually to become sugar. And this was highly specialized kind of work, highly specialized. Everything had to be done in order. Everything had to be done in a certain time. For example, when the cane is burnt, then it had to be reaped within 48 hours or it would lose its sucrose content, which means the juice that would then make sugar. So the plantation now, let's go back to this point of the plantation being a total institution. What does this mean? It means that the plantation embodied the entire lives of all of the occupants, not just the enslaved, but also for the whites who lived on the plantations. And when we're talking about the whites on the plantations, we are talking about the plantation owners. And sometimes the plantation owners did not live on the plantations. Sometimes they were absentee planters, and they had a manager or an attorney who took care of the affairs of the plantation. And then you would have the overseer's house, you would have the bookkeeper's house. The bookkeeper would be the person who keeps the records and the transactions and so on, keeps the money, something like an accountant these days. So the plantation system encompassed the entire lives, social, political life. In fact, people were classified in a social structure based on race, based on color, and also based on different other factors too. People were classified in a social structure, very rigid social structure. For example, if you were black, there's no way you could be at the top of the social structure, because if you were black, you were supposed to be a slave, and so on. It dictated their movement. It existed to ensure the successful production of sugar and its byproducts. Now we're going to have to do very quickly resistance. And resistance is a topic that we'll only begin today, because next week we're going to have part 2 of the historical process. We are only going to begin looking at resistance today. All right, now the indigenous peoples, their resistance took mainly the form of suicide, infanticide, marronage, yes. So the indigenous peoples were actually the first grouping of people who did marronage. They ran away. For example, when the British invaded Jamaica in 1655, many of the indigenous people who were left back, some of them, they were told by the Spanish that if they helped to defend the country, then they would be allowed their freedom. Some of them fought on the side of the British, some of them fought on the side of the Spanish, and then some of them ran away into the mountains. And then Africans came and joined them, and it was this mixed group that became the first groups of Maroons. And then they also had armed resistance. The Kalinago people put up armed resistance for the most part, and the Taino too, because in one case in Cuba, a Sikh in Cuba actually put up armed resistance against the whites. Why were they unsuccessful? Let's use our brains to decide that. Why would the indigenous people be unsuccessful in their attempts to resist the whites? Think about it. All right, now the enslaved Africans, their resistance took 2 forms, and we categorize resistance in 2 forms. Non-insurrectionary, formerly called passive, but we don't use that term anymore, because we are saying that all of the resistance, there was some deliberation to it. So it's not passive, it's just non-insurrectionary. In other words, non-violent. And then we also have insurrectionary resistance. So next week is when we will delve a little bit more into the insurrectionary resistance. But let's just look a little bit at the non-insurrectionary forms. Abortion, very, very popular. Pretending to be ill, yes? Prolonging breastfeeding. So they have a child and the child is to be weaned. And the child is walking and they prolong the breastfeeding. Why? Because they could get the time off from the fields to go and feed the child. They damaged equipment. They pretended to be stupid. Very good one. Very, very good one. You know, play fool for catch wise. That's how we say it in Jamaica. Play fool for catch wise. Right? We have cultural resistance now. Stories and songs and dances and all of these sayings that we used in order to resist. Right? Some people say it's just survival, but it was also resistance. And we have economic resistance. Let's look very quickly at economic resistance. Even though the enslaved people were chattel, they were still allowed little areas called the provision grounds where they could grow some food. They would take this food to market, they would sell it, they would earn a little, and sometimes they would then, so this internal marketing system became a very important economic area for them, because this is when they could have some kind of autonomy over their own lives. So the sale from the produce and jobbing, you know, like the blacksmiths, they would go to other plantations and do jobbing. The sale from this produce, they would save it. Some of them bought themselves out of slavery. Yes, we call that manumission. They bought themselves out of slavery from these little earnings. And so this was economic resistance. Last thing we will look at for today is the cultural resistance. And you know, when you talk about the cultural resistance, you're just getting me excited now, because this is right up my alley. We're talking about Anansi stories, for example. And Anansi was the form, a spider. It took a spider form in the Caribbean. But Anansi was actually the West Indian form, or is the West Indian form of the West African god, in some places called Legba. And he was the god of cunning and trickery, right? Can you tell me any Anansi stories? Do you know the one of how Anansi reach up in the house top? Always in the house top? Yes, man, that's a very, very popular Anansi story. Do you know the one of Anansi and the plantain? Very quickly, Miss say, Anansi no do not more than him family hungry and him going to the woods. 7 of them in the family. And him see a plantain with 6. He saw a hand of plantain with 6 on it. And Anansi cut the plantain and he carried it home to him family. And what did Anansi do? Give everyone one of the plantain. And then Anansi start to bawl to him family. Oh, they wicked to him. They not give none of the plantain. You know what Anansi did? Everybody end up cut their plantain in half and give Anansi. How much plantain Anansi end up with? Anansi not easy. We also have slave songs such as Wade in the Water and I'll Fly Away. All of these are forms of resistance. Next time on Class Time, we are going to be looking at the insurrectionary resistance of the Africans. And so this wraps up our class for today. That's all for today. Today we discussed the historical process in Cape Caribbean Studies. We will continue next time. We hope you grasp some of the points we discussed.